In 2024, some nations are experiencing rapid decline, heading toward total collapse. Hyperinflation, skyrocketing unemployment, and shortages of essential resources like food, water, and fuel are pushing countries to the brink. This isn't just about tough times. These nations are facing political instability, economic crises, and widespread social unrest. Today, we're exploring the 10 fastest collapsing countries, revealing the shocking data and causes behind their downfall. Global unrest is at an all-time high, fueled by failed economies, climate change, and humanitarian crises. In some of these countries, currencies have lost up to 90% of their value, and civil stability is crumbling. What's sending these nations into freefall, and can they recover? Let's take a deep dive into these countries on the brink. 1. Lebanon. Lebanon's situation is dire, with hyperinflation soaring to nearly 190% in 2024. Prices for basic essentials have surged, making everyday life unaffordable. The Lebanese pound has lost over 95% of its value, and more than 75% of the population now lives below the poverty line. Banks have failed, millions have lost their savings, and unemployment has soared to over 30%. Political infighting and sectarian divisions have paralyzed the government, and external pressures, such as dependence on imports, exacerbate the crisis. Migration rates are climbing, but for many, survival is a daily struggle, and the outlook for Lebanon is bleak. 2. Venezuela. Venezuela's economic collapse is a textbook example of hyperinflation. With inflation surpassing 400% in 2024, the bolivar is almost worthless. Basic groceries require stacks of cash, and the country's oil industry, once a source of wealth, now contributes to the crisis due to mismanagement and falling production. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled in search of a better life, while those who remain suffer from widespread food and power shortages. Venezuela's inability to diversify its economy has created an apocalyptic environment, leaving millions to fight for survival. 3. Haiti. Haiti's ongoing crisis is fueled by political instability, gang violence, and natural disasters. Approximately 60% of Haitians survive on less than $2.50 a day. Inflation exceeds 20%, and in Port-au-Prince, gang violence makes it nearly impossible for the government to maintain control. Public health care is in shambles, with severe shortages of medicines and medical personnel. Half the population lacks access to clean drinking water, and the country's weak economy is unable to support recovery efforts after frequent natural disasters. International aid is often hindered by corruption, leaving many Haitians trapped in a cycle of poverty and despair. 4. Myanmar. Myanmar's crisis escalated after the 2021 military coup. Violence has intensified, and over 1 in 4 people now require humanitarian aid. Inflation has surged, and food and fuel are becoming luxuries for many. Sanctions have crippled Myanmar's economy, and internal conflict has displaced millions. Recent flooding added to the devastation, damaging homes, crops, and infrastructure. With little access to aid and worsening conditions, Myanmar's decline shows no signs of slowing. 5. Sudan. Sudan's descent into chaos is marked by a brutal civil conflict and economic collapse. Since fighting broke out in 2023, over 4 million people have been displaced. Inflation has skyrocketed past 200%, making basic goods unaffordable, and food shortages are rampant due to flooding and droughts. The government's authority is barely intact, with militias controlling large regions. The country's healthcare system is in ruins, and international aid efforts are hampered by ongoing violence. Sudan's rapid collapse is evident, with millions facing daily struggles for survival. 6. Afghanistan. Afghanistan's economic crisis has worsened under the Taliban regime since 2021. Unemployment hovers at 40%, and over 90% of the population lives in poverty. International sanctions have isolated the country, and the banking system remains paralyzed. Women face severe restrictions, and the economy is further stunted by droughts that have decimated agriculture. Basic health care is scarce, and food prices are beyond reach for many families. Afghanistan is trapped in a cycle of poverty, isolation, and despair. 7. Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's economic collapse began with its 2022 bankruptcy declaration and has continued with high inflation and widespread shortages. The Sri Lankan rupee has lost significant value, making essential goods unaffordable. The IMF's $3 billion bailout hasn't been enough to stabilize the economy, and political instability continues to undermine efforts at recovery. Power outages and fuel shortages disrupt daily life, while hospitals face critical shortages of medicines and supplies. With political unrest and economic mismanagement, Sri Lanka is on the edge of total collapse. 8. Yemen. Yemen's civil war and famine have created one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Over 80% of Yemen's population is in need of assistance, and inflation has made food and medicine nearly impossible to afford. The healthcare system is collapsing, with many hospitals destroyed in airstrikes. Cholera and other diseases are rampant due to a lack of sanitation, and food insecurity is widespread. Conflict and high fuel prices hinder aid distribution, leaving Yemenis to fight for survival in a war-torn, famine-stricken country. 9th Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. Despite its vast natural resources, the DRC remains mired in poverty and instability. Over 70% of the population lives below the poverty line, and inflation surged to 22% in 2024. Armed groups control large parts of the eastern DRC, where violence and conflict over resources displace millions. Healthcare and education systems are collapsing, and international aid efforts are limited due to the dangerous conditions. The DRC's vast wealth is overshadowed by political corruption and violence, leaving the population struggling to survive in one of the world's most resource-rich yet unstable nations. 10. Pakistan. Pakistan is grappling with a combination of natural disasters, economic instability, and political turmoil. In 2024, devastating floods displaced millions, and inflation surged to 30%, making basic necessities unaffordable. The Pakistani rupee has plummeted, and energy shortages are frequent, disrupting daily life. Political instability further complicates recovery efforts, with leadership changes and protests exacerbating the situation. Pakistan's path to recovery seems steep as it struggles to deal with the compounded effects of climate change, economic challenges, and political dysfunction. The rapid collapse of these countries highlights the complex interplay of economic, political, and social forces that can drive a nation to the brink. Whether it's mismanagement, conflict, or external pressures, these nations are facing unprecedented challenges, and the road to recovery seems increasingly out of reach. The world must pay attention to these crises, as they are not only humanitarian tragedies, but also a warning of the fragility of nations in the modern age.